Welcome to episode 51 of Contrarian Corner. I'm Ben Kelleran. Today we have a very special return guest on to talk with us about the progress of Trump 2.0, talk about markets, geopolitics, tariffs, commodities, everything else in between. I think it'll be a fascinating conversation because I just had the other half of Gold, Goats, and Guns on last week, but I think it'll be good to catch up with Dexter White because he's, I guess I haven't had on for almost a year now, so I think it'll be good to catch up. But Dexter, thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Has it really been a year? That's crazy,
Yeah,
actually.
pretty close to it. I think it was sometime in June or July, somewhere in there. So
Wow.
it feels weird to have been doing the podcast for a year, but I guess here we are. So
Yeah, you've been doing a great job, and Substack too. Everybody should definitely check you out and follow you there. It's you're doing good stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's been going pretty well. Got a lot of interesting stuff going on, but I do want to kind of pick your brain on Trump 2.0, kind of progress they've made, what they're doing with tariffs, tax cuts, spending cuts, all these different things, and the different agendas that are playing out. You see a lot of people freaking out on social media and a lot of people basically thinking the sky is falling, it's financial Armageddon, the markets are going to collapse, it's 1929 all over again. But I'm curious to hear what you have to say on kind of where things are roughly 3 months into the administration, because things have been moving quickly. And I think everyone has a little bit of a sense of unease and a lot of uncertainty about kind of the process and the progress being made by Trump 2.0.
Yeah, agreed. I think a conversation like this is, it's an intersection of policy, messaging, and I think a lot really is just the X factor of Trump himself and how that affects the ability for those around him to execute, how it affects their longevity in the administration, and how much he brings he has a tendency to put as many pots on the fire as he chooses without any regard to how many burners there are. So I think, like, if you want to, I'll start with that. Like, in the beginning, I mean, obviously the first, let's say, 45 days of the administration, the only way you could describe it was shock and awe. But there was, I think, a complete, I mean, he put the media right on their ass. And they didn't know what to do. They were just completely flabbergasted. While at the same time, I don't think he did anything that they could really get their teeth into. Tariffs, for the last, I mean, it's only been 16 days, right? And it feels like the entire administration. And the media's been able to get their feet sort of planted, and I'm not saying it's the right message or even a valid one, but they've found their thing now. They're going with this chaos and corruption is the new little phrase you're going to hear everywhere. From, I guess it's going to be with, like, the video that everyone showed when it was every single, like, newscaster and all the local newscasters reading the same script, and there was, like, the grid and they're all talking together.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that's the Hakeem Jeffries and Pocahontas and Pelosi. Like, it's going to be like that at the national level now. So the one thing I've noticed, though, is that the international press, I mean, maybe it's more the Anglo-American press, but they've always been fellow travelers, and they've always been, I think, aligned clearly, and it was unambiguous. But I haven't seen the level of complete unitary alignment before, like, this last period. What I mean by that is the British press, the Euro press, and the American press that are against Trump are all against Trump in the exact same way. And it was kind of arresting. I was like, oh, wow, there's a global superstate. I kind of, not something I haven't noticed before, but they're out there pulling levers in ways that they don't usually do it. And the optimistic part of me thinks, well, they've never been this scared before. And the pessimistic side says, well, he's gotten their attention in a way that they've decided to pull out all the stops. And, that's the first thing I'm nervous about.
Well, and to your point, it's pretty blatant too, right? When you see the way they're kind of running with certain messages, it's pretty much out in the open where like you're saying, it is very unified.
The headlines are the same. I mean, I mean, the first risk for, so let's talk a second about Drudge Report. You know, I think a lot of us go to Drudge because we went to Drudge 15, 20 years ago all the time. And it's just our fingers go there before we think what we're doing. You know, you just type it in, and Drudge is just a fundamentally different thing. And the first problem with Drudge is most of the endpoints are British, right? It's the Daily Mail, it's the Sun, which allegedly, you know, is the American, but it's, you know, it's really just another British tabloid, you know, and everything about British style journalism writing is just kind of infuriatingly, you know, it's meant to just push your buttons. It's very, you know, bury the lead, you know, just a bunch of, I kind of detest it. And every day that I wind up on any website that I've clicked through from Drudge, I look at myself and I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you reading this crap? And yet you immediately then you can go to CNN and notice that there's complete, you know, unity in messaging. And this is definitely new. And you know, is it Davos? I don't know, but it's the industry, and the industry is very much, you know, not okay with a change in the status quo. Is the way I would put it. And that's an interesting variable. Now, I think he's done them a favor by, you know, not having a clear articulated reason for what we're doing. And I think a lot of us, you know, including me and Tom, you know, we run around and we try to create these stories that fit the facts that we see, and like it's sort of a backfilled narrative. But I'm not really that comfortable doing it when we get to the point where I don't see the point of starting certain fights. Like, why is he starting a fight with Powell? I had a conversation with Tom this morning. I said, you know, I was like, don't worry about it. You know, Powell and Bassett have lunch every Monday and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, so it's kayfabe. And I totally understand that Trump can go out there and play the Iron Sheik or whatever, you know, the evil wrestling character of your choices. But I'm like struggling to see what the point of shit talking Jay Powell is. When chances are, you know, they're not going to cut. They'll cut in June. And like, what's the point? Like, why get everybody angry at Powell on the MAGA side of, you know, especially people who frankly don't even, you know, broadly know what the Federal Reserve does, you know, on downstream. Obviously, I'm not talking about our listeners, but in the broader sense, like what's your take on just that kind of, you know, antagonism? There's another word for it.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to see how quickly the focus jumps from tariffs to fighting with Powell to, right, what's going on in the economy, what's going on in China, whatever it is. But I think the thing that, like, the back and forth on Powell at the Fed is, I wouldn't be surprised if they're setting things up for, right, obviously new Fed chair next year, and they, I think, are trying to find a way to create a soft landing for the U.S. economy, whatever, financial markets, all the above. That's actually a piece I have in the can, or partially worked on, where, like, kind of the big picture question is, how do you create a soft landing for a hyper financialized economy? And you can basically work backwards from, okay, well, if you want to do that, you can't have an equity market crash. You can't have rates too high. You can't have a real estate crash. You can't have, right, all these things. And so I think their talk with Powell, or I guess talk at Powell from Trump, I think is basically signaling, hey, like, we're going to need a couple favors, whether that's rate cuts earlier than June. Maybe that's what it is. I mean, I'm not sure what exactly that's going to do, but I think it will be interesting to watch to see where that heads, because I know there's a lot of people that are pretty nervous about the state of the economy, state of kind of global supply chains, all these different things. But yeah, I guess I'll just toss it back to you there, and if you want to add to that. But I just see there's so many different puzzle pieces, and they're all like connected to where, I don't know if you've seen the meme of Charlie from It's Always Sunny, right? With the conspiracy theory board, whatnot.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of where I feel like we are at now, where it's like you have to try and connect all these dots and figure out,
Yeah. No.
okay, what the hell's going on?
Yeah.
Right?
I'm very familiar with that thought process. It's kind of our brand, but but yeah, but you know, like, to be self-critical, like, you get to a point where you have to start asking yourself, like, are you, like, at what point are you, delivering tomorrow's zeitgeist today versus schizo posting? And that's, where
Yeah.
I always try to, like, kind of the conversations I have with Tom are pretty much about, like, causality without, just the idea of open causality is just a very risky thing, especially now that we're going into a post AI commercialization world. You have to be very, very careful about what you view as valid inputs. And what's interesting, like, you and I both were talking about, like, not really about policy here. We're talking about what should we believe that is Trump's motivation, like, kind of a little of what you were talking about there. And I think that brings us back to messaging and intent. Like, intent has to come first. You can't message that which you don't know. And I'd like to give Trump and the administration credit enough to say that they have some idea of what they want to do. The question is how do you message it? And they've not come out and said per se that the goal is trade equalization, but the tariff structures, obviously there's two parts of the tariff conversation. What they came out with on, I guess, April 2nd or 3rd, whichever day they actually released the list, is a combination of tariff matching, and I think that's a very clear, easy to message thing that they could have hit out of the park, even if, the Democrats didn't want to hear the message. I don't think there would have been much of a defense if all he did was say, hey, these are the countries in the world that are tariffing us. I'm not going to tolerate it. I'm going to match them in 90 days and I'm going to half match them tomorrow. And here's the list. Okay, fine. But what really happened was that component, separately a 20% fentanyl tariff on China, which I totally agree with. And then the third element, which is the controversial part, that is the part that gave the media their first footing in the entirety of this administration, is he basically looked at the trade deficit for every country and used it as a percentage to add to whatever base tariff rate they had. Okay, that is a radical vision of trade. And if that's the intent, how do you message that? Interestingly, the media's response to it was, he's crazy. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Stupid, stupid, stupid. And it's like, okay, I understand it's very emotionally satisfying to have that reaction for them. And it was very satisfying.
They at least know which audience they're catering to.
Well, they also figured out what the notes of the chorus were for the first time in the whole, 90 days or so,
Mm-hmm.
And so, thank God we can all sing a song together is the first thing they thought. But, I was pushing back a friend of mine who's, I wouldn't call him to the left, but I would call him, I don't know what to call him anymore, but he used to be very right wing, but now he's not. And he's a trader and he understands markets quite well, but he just starts with this stupid, stupid, stupid stuff. And I said, look, you don't have to like it and you can say whatever you want about Trump, but this is not stupid. It's radical. And you maybe you think it's crazy, but like, it's not stupid that they picked a number based on a trade deficit. It's a thing. And if they mean it, like, we have to talk about it. And yet we're not having a national conversation about that. I think it's a much easier conversation to have to say, look, the Marshall Plan's over. We shouldn't be subsidizing Europe's products. They shouldn't be allowed to have protective boundaries around ours, and I'm not even necessarily a free trader, but I am very willing to criticize the status quo and say, look, it's just weighted against the United States in the most basic terms of fairness. And if you throw in, our above average obligations to NATO, and I'm talking just about Europe here, it's just intolerable. It's like, look, pay your bills, buy our cars, and I think that's easy messaging. Now, when I look to countries that are net exporters of commodities, whether it's like the Congo or Senegal or wherever, some country in Africa that's producing cobalt or other metals for iPhones, do we really expect them not to be net exporters? Like, and how much are they really, out of balance, right? And maybe when you look down Trump's little skills, like, oh yeah, but he's not really reacting to them. It's true, but if you have a principle and you believe in your intent, and then you create a policy, you need to have a story other than it all goes through the president, and that's what we, I think, have wound up with. And unless you're willing to construct, I'm going to tease Tom a little bit. It's like, if you're willing to construct a backward narrative that, Trump's a super genius, a la Reagan on SNL and whenever that was, okay, but I need some touch points of like what the future is when we equalize trade. Like, we don't have a lot of the industries that we're slamming the door on. So there's not really even a substitution, right? The point of tariffs at the most basic level, and this is where we really have to talk about, like, why are they even calling them tariffs when it's something totally different? But the point of a tariff is to protect your own industry, right? Now, libertarian, free trader, whatever conventional economic religion you belong to, we all understand the theory of, comparative advantage, and, tariffs are artificial and inefficient production, blah, blah, blah. But at some point, a nation wants to make its own steel and grow its own food and probably make its own drugs, just so that other countries who may have comparative advantage in those things can't screw it over on a whim. What happened to us during COVID with medical supplies and pharmaceuticals vis-a-vis China was intolerable, and we need to make that not the status quo anymore. We, on the other hand, like, if we don't have an industry, unlike rare earths, I don't know that we have a ton of cobalt, so we got to buy it from Congo, and we may have things to say about their mining methods and the age of their miners and all that sort of stuff that we pretend to care about, but everybody's got an iPhone, or a Galaxy or whatever. They don't seem to be willing to live without the cobalt. They want to post about how much they hate child, labor on their iPhone. It's like, well, until you're willing to send that in on a postcard to the New York Times, shut the fuck up.
Yeah. No, so it is funny to watch the hypocrisy about some of these different issues. I know that the approach of, oh, well, they do it too, or whatever, is like juvenile, but it is funny to watch. But I think, to your point on, like, the Congo, they're not exactly a booming market for, like, software as a service, for example. So,
right,
like you're saying, there's going to be an expectation that we're probably going to have a deficit with a country like that. Whereas to move to China, which I think it's becoming obvious, if people haven't already figured it out, that China's like the main target of a lot of the recent policies, and whether it's like isolation strategy or forcing other groups to basically pick one, US or China. I think that's kind of what is happening with Europe right now. But the way I kind of view it is, okay, there's a tug of war between China, which needs the US consumer, otherwise their economy is in rough shape, and the US, which needs Chinese debt markets and the supply chain, at least in its current form. So, like, I think that's a big tug of war going on. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say on where you think things might be headed with US and China.
Yeah, I think I'll kind of just one last comment on the trade equalization theory. Like, I think that when we think about it vis-a-vis China, it's a much more rational and desirable thing. And maybe that could have been a easy messaging thing for them to say, we're not talking about the developing world, but China's not the developing world, right? Like we need to talk about what they used to call most favored nation, and now like normal trade relations or permanent normal trade relations. That needs to end. We need to cancel PNTR for China. And they need to go through a review every year again. And we also need to, I mean, you could argue that just the concept of the 20% fentanyl tariff is probably a de facto ending of that. But the the idea of equalizing trade, meaning having a net zero balance with China, is highly unrealistic in the near term. And yet, a lot of the stuff we think of when we go to the store as, oh God, this is obviously made in China these days, when you pick it up, you'll notice a lot of textiles are now made in India, and a lot of the other stuff is made in Vietnam, and also Taiwan, like for a lot of the tools and like cheaper goods that you think of, like, so there are absolutely substitutions that can be rapidly switched. Most furniture is not coming from China anymore. Most furniture is coming from Vietnam. Now, that doesn't mean a lot's not coming from China. Vietnam has not replaced China. But you can, if you want to avoid China, you have a lot more options than you did even 3 to 4 years ago. And I think that China is a hostile. I really struggle to even call them a competitor anymore. They want dominance within the first and second island chains, not just their near term. And they're building an access denial Army, Navy, and Air Force and missile force, more to the point, to threaten, the Straits of Malacca and like everything that the U.S. Navy's sort of been able to roam freely. And inevitably, it's going to be a direct threat to Australia before, anybody else. And then the question of Japan and South Korea, I mean, they're building for this. Now, whether they really want to do it, or if it's all about Taiwan for them, which, I think most Americans don't really know the history, and they don't, for better or for worse, Taiwan is, certainly a different example than Russia invading Ukraine. And even Russia invading Ukraine is a lot different than like Russia invading Poland. Not that that's happened for a while, at least.
Not this century.
At least since 1940. No, it happened in
Yeah,
1941 for sure. But it just, Soviet Union, Russia, same thing to me. But like, these are ethnic issues, and I can, as much as I would view an invasion of Taiwan by China to be a hugely cataclysmic issue that would require an American response, I do understand the Chinese perspective on it, that it's a renegade province, blah, 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 because, it is. And the question for Americans is, are we willing to make a stand against, the Chinese Communist Party or not? And if we're not, then, fucking give TSMC some more, more tax breaks, and let's get these chip plants built in Arizona. Because if we're going to if we don't have that role in the world anymore, now, granted, if you say that, then you're inviting the invasion. So I understand why you wouldn't say that explicitly, but is that where we're going? It's a good question. And it's a good question if Japan wants to live in that world, if South Korea, although South Korea has made a lot of, friendly relations with China a priority in the past several years. And, I wouldn't argue that the South Koreans are fundamentally a U.S., satrap anymore, which may be to their benefit or to their peril. I mean, it's remains to be seen. But I think both the Biden administration not getting rid of the tariffs on China, and frankly all the national military planning, every year, like the annual defense review stuff, we understand that China is not just a pure competitor, that they're a legitimate threat to U.S. operations worldwide. And that's why Trump's, pushing so hard at Panama. And frankly, I mean, Greenland's a separate issue, more about Russia. But, I think they view it like, well, what if China starts, China's done Arctic naval exercises with the Russians. So I think just kind of claiming the Arctic Circle as the idea of putting a U.S. footprint bigger than Alaska in the Arctic Circle region it makes sense if you're thinking in a long-term strategic way. And I think a lot of U.S. policy that of the people that hate Trump. Like a lot of people are on board with the anti-China stuff, big time.
Yeah, I think to your point, as you were talking there, I was writing down Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada, like return of the Monroe Doctrine, and I think that's kind of the perfect segue into that topic because I think on at like a broad stroke level, what we're seeing is there's going to be certain areas where, okay, China is a regional superpower in this part of the world. Russia has influence over most of Eastern Europe. And then the US has North and South America to some extent. And the Panama Canal is obviously one of the most important choke points for commerce there. And from what I've heard, it sounds like there's U.S. Special Forces on the ground there. And I know guys like Michael Yan have been following it very closely. I think he's actually down there. But what do you think about the return of the Monroe Doctrine, the focus on areas that are closer to home, and kind of where that heads as far as, okay, do we completely take over Panama Canal? Do we buy Greenland? Do we make some moves in Canada, or does Canada start to crack depending on how their election goes? I'll let you take it wherever you want from there. But I think it is interesting to see the unipolar world order start to break and becoming pretty obvious to, I think, just about everybody at this point.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not sure it's really the return of the Monroe Doctrine, but I mean, maybe it's Trumpian manifest destiny. Um, I'll say this: the Monroe Doctrine was pretty much against. It was basically telling the Europeans that like we were going to be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, and it was sort of, I'd say, presaged the broad colonial liberation movements. If people always try to turn the U.S. into a colonial power, but any reasonable study of history, like makes a mockery of that. But people still do it every day, and they want to be taken seriously. But I don't take them seriously. Being an anti-communist nation for many years in our policy is not the same as being a colonialist, no matter what the communists like to say. But what I will say is I am a big fan of maybe redirecting the idea of American unipolarity towards saying, look, the Western Hemisphere is again sort of under our umbrella. And if we, have to rationally concede that the whole world isn't under our control, which I think is good for us. I am a big fan of repelling Chinese influence within the Western Hemisphere, especially the Caribbean and Central America, because of what I see down the road as the real world threats in future warfare, where it's not going to be about moving divisions of men. It's going to be about moving automated materiel. And, this could be all accomplished like through coordinated drone swarms with, if you control all the ports in the Bahamas on both ends of the Panama Canal, you can pre-position enough war material, i.e. missiles and drones and other things like that, to really overcome the idea of really needing a credible blue water navy of the type we've had for the past 40 to 50 years. Just because China's building carriers doesn't mean that they think the answer is to build 12 carriers and parity match the US. Everybody's thinking about the future of naval operations. And I think denying them bases disguised as commercial points of presence is a key strategic, absolute requirement of the United States for its future safety. I hope that Trump is not just bloviating, that like part of this is there's like broad alignment. I feel like there's alignment in the Pentagon about China being a credible threat. And I feel like there's alignment about understanding that, we don't want them taking over every port in South America or doing military cooperation with Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not sure anybody on the left really had the balls to even fantasize about taking back the Panama Canal, but God bless him, Trump did. So it's a key goal. And, I always say like Trump, has been heavily influenced by this sort of 70s negotiation style that was very in vogue when he went to business school. He believes in the ZOPA and the zone of potential agreement. He understands that what's called a midpoint fallacy is a fatal way of maximizing what you want. You don't negotiate to the middle, and yet everyone wants to. And so there's two ways to beat that fallacy. You set the zone as wide as possible, which means you ask for crazy stuff. In pricing terms, if you think something's worth about $50 and they're going to lowball you 30, the dumbest thing you can do, is come in at 70, because then you're just going to negotiate to 50, and that's what it's really worth. You don't want 50, you want 80, so you set your price at 130, and they just think you're nuts. You're like, it's not worth that. But then you start going through midpoint fallacies on their side, and you get them up to 60, 70, 80, no problem. That's the Trumpian worldview. That's how he believes negotiation works. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not, you don't want to apply too much game theory or finesse to Trump. It's like, he just thinks, open wide, meaning open the zone wide with crazy offers, and just stare them down to the point where you degrade their willingness to defend their opening offer, and they just start coming towards your position. And that's his playbook, mixed with some wrestling kayfabe. And I've never seen him do anything that doesn't basically meet that pattern. And I'm not even saying that's bad. It works for him. But that's the technique. And that's clearly been the technique on the tariff, explosion, whatever you want to call it. That's his idea. He's like, oh, now I'm going to go back and do all these deals. I see a different forest for the trees, but he absolutely thinks he's just going to get everybody in line, and then we're going to be left with the recalcitrant China problem, which is, we're always going to have that. So at least we got everybody else, cleared up. And he says he's going to do a deal with China. I mean, I guess, but I don't think it'll look good if he does a deal with China. It'll make him look very weak, in my view. I mean, obviously, depending on the depending on the deal. China signaled a very, willingness to negotiate with the proviso that with the, what did they say? It has to be done with respect. They're basically saying okay, we've had enough of this and that. Now, I personally, I really care deeply about the fentanyl crisis. And I think that destabilizing all these other relationships gives China an opportunity to run around and kind of play this anti-Trump role against all the basically leftists in each one of these countries and give them, virtue signaling points. And I think I don't think that's a good strategy, because I think Trump's messaging, and I said this on a previous podcast with Tom, it's like, we have 100,000 people dying every year. That's, equivalent to what we were losing in World War II. We lost around 460,000 troops in World War II, fought about 4 years. We lost 58,000 in the entire 10 years plus of Vietnam. So 100,000 a year, adjusted for population, is way more than, it's basically equivalent. It's a little less, but it's equivalent to World War II. We're fighting World War II. We're fighting against a power who's, frankly, mispunishing us for, we weren't even a party in the Opium Wars in any credible way. If you're killing 100,000 Brits, I'd be like, well, payback's a bitch. But the U.S. role in the Opium War, not significant. And separately, who cares? It's not okay. This is warfare, and we should be treating it as warfare, and we should be willing to suffer the disengagement costs, but with the moral right to say, look, we're protecting our people, and look, we don't like this any more than, this isn't optimal economically, but China is going to stop this, and we're going to stop Mexico from being a waylay point for these drugs. We're going to stop Chinese investment in Mexico, which facilitates relationships with cartels, which facilitates the smuggling. We're going to also apply this to Canada. I'm sorry, we have two narco state neighbors, and, the Canadians may be so shocked and offended to hear that, but, it doesn't matter. Chinese gangs in Canada, control a lot of when I say Western Canada here, I mean more like Vancouver. I'm not talking about Alberta, but you know, China has a serious foothold on the western coast of Canada, and they use it to bring a lot of drugs into our country with the specific objective to kill Americans. And that's war. And why we're not willing to just say that, blows, if we're willing to put a 245% tariff on, and I agree with Xi, that's meaningless. It's like, that's a trade embargo. Good. But do it, and do it for the reason that's real. When you've seen a lot of these Chinese videos making fun of the tariffs, right? Some of them might even be, they might be actual, just, like the Chinese sign guy, China, China, China. Like, I don't think the CCP controls that guy. I think he's just funny, and good for him. But and a lot of these people that I see, I mean, I think the same thing about them. Like, yeah, they're just making videos. But when I see the videos, the coordinated videos making fun of American factory workers as being strung out on fentanyl, that comes from the CCP. And it's like, if you want to play that level of propaganda game with us, you know what? We're just going to call it like it is. You're killing 100,000 Americans a year. And I'm sorry, Apple, but we're done. And just shut the door and say, yeah, we're at war. We're just going to admit it. And Canada and Mexico, you're going to stop trading with them, or you're going to have kinetic consequences. That is, if that level of disruption scares people, the only question I have is, why do you tolerate 100,000 American dead a year? Like, I agree that would be highly disruptive to the global order. I agree that would be equivalent. I mean, all these things, but so what? Like, who are we as a people if we're willing to tolerate and absorb 100,000 dead a year? It just, that to me is, insanity and decadence.
I think to add to that, I think for a lot of people, especially financial talking head types, the fentanyl and the deaths from it flies under the radar in a lot of ways. But I think you're spot on. I was kind of talking about this last week with Vince Lanci, and I was kind of saying, hey, there's, I think, other motivations that are potentially like, hey, if you guys cut the shit out with the fentanyl and back off on the Panama Canal and basically put things in reverse on some of the maybe not kinetic war strategies, but obviously are trying to undermine the U.S. If you do that, then we'll go back to 10% or 20% blanket tariff, whatever it is. Because I think, like you said, the 245 or whatever percent it's up to now, that is effectively an embargo. But I think it will be interesting to see kind of where all this stuff heads, because all this is kind of fuzzy on where it goes. But I think the two big pieces I think are pretty clear is that Trump doesn't want a massive, like, full-scale kinetic war, whether it's Ukraine, Middle East, wherever it might be. I don't think he wants a massive, like, trade war if there are certain things that can be met on basically the U.S. side of, hey, these are non-negotiables. They're pretty reasonable, right? And like you said, he's going to negotiate for more than that. But I think, like, the stuff like the fentanyl and all these other things are must-haves for the U.S. if we want to get our house in order. So,
I mean, I recognize how dissonant what I just said about, just cutting them off and, ripping the Band-Aid off is. I mean, I recognize that we can't produce a heck of a lot of the stuff we get from China that would be hugely disruptive. My point is you can't kick the can down the road forever. And a lot of people just think we can print money and run a trade deficit, and they don't seem to understand that interest rate cycles, and are we going to have 100 trillion a year deficit? No, we're going to have less. Okay, well, start doing the math on the bond payment, the repayment charts of U.S. debt. You can't ignore this. And if it becomes existential financially down the road, and it's already existential for, admittedly, I guess a large part of our population that the powers that be are willing to ignore. I mean, they're willing to send these same people off to war. So I'm not under no illusions that they care about their lives. But, I think a people has the right to demand that their government address these things. And when a foreign power is doing what they're doing, like, it has to be addressed. And some of that, the answer to it can't be like, well, but the market might crash. It's like, yeah, nobody wants the market to crash, but tolerating the intolerable isn't okay either. And having a political party in this country that, specifically the Democrats, that have a heck of a lot of members who should not have security clearances because of their involvement with China, that's not okay either. Eric Swalwell. Every time that idiot opens his mouth, I mean, when he, think about this. If there's any vote of his about any bill related to fentanyl, when you look at him, yeah, I don't care if he votes with his party or not. Like, the question is who told him to vote that way? Fang Fang or Pelosi? And Pelosi's office is fully penetrated, just like Feinstein's was. So, it's this is, again, people can call it crazy, but don't call it stupid. I'm just at a different place in my not just my perception. I think everybody knows the deal. I don't think it's just like secret knowledge in any way. I'm not personally willing to like say it's tolerable. And I know a lot of people don't agree with me. A lot of people think they're elitists, who are basically what we used to call upper middle class. And, they don't understand that how little power they have. They just, they're like, awfuls, affluent white female liberals. Like, these people just don't see that. They think this world they live in is going to last forever. And I think when you study history enough, you realize, like, we're at an event horizon, and we need to get pharmaceutical production back under our own control. We need to get military industrial policy figured out fast, because there's going to come a time when people are shocked at, I'll put it this way, Hegseth, which I was very surprised for him to say, but like, we're 10 carrier sinkings away from a whole, different global hegemon.
Yeah. I mean, and you think about it too, with some of the missile technology and drones and other stuff going on. I don't think the weapon of the future or the like battlefield changing technology is carriers at this point, right?
Nope.
With drones, with some of the different missile technology out there. I think there's going to be a shift where a lot of people realize, like, hey, there's a lot of things have changed, and it's I'm not saying it's completely different from past styles of warfare, but there are certain things where is the future the top of the line, like $1 billion fighter jet programs? Probably not, right?
What do you think these drone swarms are? I mean, does everyone think it's just hobbyists of like drone hackers fucking with people, or do you not understand that we have lots of agents, most likely Chinese, testing the reaction capabilities and the reaction intensity over and over and over again? Because
they have like what, 70% of the drone market as far as capacity. I was listening to a podcast the other day that said it's that
in the consumer space they have like 100, but in the military space, yeah, I think it's about 70.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that is there even a credible competitor to DJI in the consumer space. But the future threat to the country I view as containerized shipping, and it's not just the ships. Like, well, you could sink the ships. It's like, yeah, but we don't inspect all the containers, and this is where the fight against the longshoremen like is going to be very interesting. Trump kind of got that, the fire put out. But if you remember that, what was that guy's name? That loudmouth prick that was telling the world he's telling Americans, oh, we're going to shut down, the port workers control America. And it's like, okay. But we need to inspect 100% of cargo in this country. And, what's interesting is maybe part of the tariff regime, bluff or not, can move us closer to port automation, because imagine a future threat where You don't need an army. You have intense drone stuff with agents on the inside doing the spotting, so to speak, that you can just direct thousands of drones onto targets, and then combine that with a hack against the energy infrastructure. And keep in mind, the containers would already be on the ground. They wouldn't just be on ships, right? They would have been pre-positioned for months in the Bahamas, in, other ports controlled by China. Then they would have been brought in. Then you bribe enough longshoremen to get a couple. It's the same way you get drugs into the country. We basically can't stop that. What makes you think we can stop, you know, 50 containers? And people always used to worry about suitcase nukes. It's like, I don't really worry about nukes because we can obliterate the entire world with 2 of our subs. So if that's where they go, like, I'm sorry, I got plenty of books on my shelf to tell you how that game ends. Like, I'm just not concerned about nuclear mad strategy.
Well, and if it does go there, like, what's the point of worrying about it too much anyway, right?
Correct. I spent half my life worrying about that shit. I'm just like, oh well, if that happens, it's all gone. So I worry a lot more the fact that we don't have any conventional deterrence. Like, we don't have any. We can't make shells. We make 65,000 shells a month. Ourselves. And the Ukrainians were shooting 100 or more. In World War II, we were making 1 million a month or 500,000 a month or something like that. I think it was 500,000 a month. Now, we don't, here's the thing people don't understand is, well, that was World War II. It's like, yeah, I mean, what's crazy is we didn't have as much artillery projection ourselves. Like, we were single, like we were lend-leasing a lot of stuff to the Soviet Union. And like, without our stuff, the Nazis would have taken Stalingrad, right? Like, people always try to make the Russians into the great, heroes of the war in the sense of strategy and tactics. Like, no, they put a lot of bodies toward it, and they should, they should be respected for that. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but American tanks and materiel, like, brought in through British India and Iran and places like that through Lend-Lease, that's what beat the Nazis. And obviously the Soviets played their role as the manpower. But my point is, we were only shooting half the bullets, shells we were making, right? And we can't even match any of these production levels. And in a conventional war now, like, we're going to be shooting more. Like, we need to be figuring out how to make at least 400,000 shells a month of 155. Because, like, we don't have a stockpile, and we don't have a stockpile of all the missiles, all the stuff. Like, this is all multi-year supply chains. That all has to change, or we have no, like, we're going to rely entirely on nuclear deterrence. Well, are we going to nuke China for invading Taiwan? I don't think so.
I hope not.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying. I think there's a lot of different moving pieces, and like the drone technology, the fentanyl and the drugs, and all these different things that are going on, where it's not just like, I think someone was calling it what, 5th generation warfare or whatever generation we're on now, where like you've got the media space and what's going on there with propaganda and how polluted that is. But at the same time, you've got all these things that really fly under the radar of most people's day-to-day lives, where they don't see it or think about it, or it doesn't touch them, so it doesn't affect them. But I think that's how we kind of ended up in this position, at least as far as things stand today. But I do want to kind of get your thoughts on financial markets, commodities, and some of the stuff that you think might be going on there, because that's mainly my bread and butter. I know we are sort of running out on time here, but I think it is interesting to see the amount of panic and the amount of just doom posting, basically, from what I've seen on Twitter about the tariffs, the economy, all these different things. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that a lot of people are freaked out. Some of them are freaking out about things that I don't worry about at all. But what are your kind of thoughts on financial markets, commodities, how that may ties into what we've been talking about with the geopolitics going on.
Yeah, I think we have a lot less depth in the financial press. And I mean that like mimetically, not so much but like political memes or images, but like the idea of like mimetic ideas. Um, and that used to be very. I mean, I'll put it this way: the number of things that are posted, let's say on Zero Hedge, and the broader community of sites that feed off of. I mean, it's a much smaller number of actors than like if you log on to CNN and like all the things that they can drive people crazy with. I think the financial press in many ways is driving what you're talking about. Like we have a low depth of, we have a low depth of field, if you will, on just like it's small criticisms of things that aren't necessarily well validated observations get blown up, and the next thing everybody on Twitter, like nobody's checked the premise, right? Like it's if you get a story up and it just gets its own kind, if it goes viral, whether it should or not, and obviously we all know that things can be intentionally made, popular by malign actors, domestic, foreign, whatever. Yeah, I tend to not pay attention to things like, I mean, I'm not saying these stories aren't, I want to be careful what I say here. I'm not saying that you can't trust the financial press. I'm saying episodically, I notice amplification of things where I'm like, is that really a big deal? Like, or is this just part of the hysteria engine that they're moving towards the financial press and that we're vulnerable to? I mean, I think a lot of, we're all transitioning to a world where there's a lot of AI source material that the signal to noise ratio is getting really bad. And I think a lot of people we all get fooled. Like there's nobody who's like, oh, I never get fooled. Okay. Everybody gets fooled because we're all going too fast. And I think you have to trust your sources by researching who your sources are. And then just, do you find them credible? And more to the point, I trust sources that you find credible more than sources that you think are right all the time, because credibility, I'll put it this way, you should judge people by being credible on whether they have a process. I listen to a lot of people I totally disagree with because I know they have a process. And I learn things from them because I know that, I may not respect their opinions. I respect the fact that they come to their opinions through a rational process. I may not respect their conclusions, but I know they take source material, analyze it, chew it up, and do their thing on. And maybe they're commies, but it's okay because there's a lot of smart Marxists out there. There's a lot of more dumb ones, I think, but I don't disrespect people based on what they believe. I can get usable information out of anybody who's intelligent, even if I find them to have detestable, values I don't share at all. And I think the lesson is you got to be really aware how much automated shit is flowing out there. And I do think I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like the financial press is becoming a battle zone even more than it was. Like we've always had gold bugs. We've always had kooks. We've always had Peter Schiff, right? Who are telling you the world's going to end tomorrow. Right. And, it's now Peter Schiff's moment. Gold is the 3,300 or whatever it's at. But, I would point out to people, Peter Schiff is right every 17 years. Govern yourself accordingly, and he's going to be, he's going to be 80 or 97 for the next two times he gets it right. So, I wouldn't trade based on what he says, which is not to say I don't own gold. I just, I didn't own it when he told me I had to. I bought it when I was like, yeah, now's the time. It wasn't 16 out of 17 years, though. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. No, to your point, I've been listening to a bunch of podcasts, and one of the themes I've got from, I think, at least 5 podcasts in the last week is talk about the death of US exceptionalism and money flowing into other markets. And it seems like one of those times where I'm not saying like it's time to go out and buy US big tech stocks. That's not my area of expertise. I don't think the valuations make a whole lot of sense, but I think the consensus that the US is basically going to be seeing a whole bunch of outflows from other areas of the world. Like with all the stuff going on, I think Martin Armstrong's closer to the right path. I think if there's any amount of chaos, you're more likely to see inflows than outflows. So, and I think things have I think there's a decent chance that things get chaotic. So that's one of the narratives that I've been seeing lately, where it was just to your point of, okay, some of these narratives get amplified or pop up at certain times. And yeah, like big tech is not where I'd go, but I think there are still plenty of opportunities in US markets and in the US where I'd rather own that than, say, European banks, which look cheap, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff there, and other things where China stocks look cheap, but you also have the fear of getting Gazprom'd, right? If you owned Russian stocks, whatever it is. So I think the thing is interesting is you have all these different people, and some of them are very smart. Like, I'm not saying they might be right. I just look at it as, okay, that many podcasts where they talk about the end of US exceptionalism, like inside like 1 week, right? I think that's kind of like the perfect illustration of your point.
Well, I would also I'd caution against conflating like the idea that American exceptionalism's survive a presence or whatever you want to say about it is one thing, and capital flows are another, right? So when it comes to American exceptionalism, I feel like there's an interface with entrepreneurship, and look, we can talk honestly about how many Americans are capable of being founders of an interesting company. But that's the wrong way to look at it. The question is what kind of founders can this country produce that no other country can? Look at the valuation of all of European startups for like the last 20 years. Like they add up to one Home Depot. Like, and that's literally true. So I don't worry about American exceptionalism. I mean, I look at, European conformity as a much more problematic trait for a continent than American exceptionalism. One thing I'll say though is like I don't think American exceptionalism is over at all, but
well, I think just
the fruits thereof, I think, is where that conversation needs to be focused. Like it's not about whether or not we have the talent. We absolutely have the talent. We have unique aspects of talent that are cultural, that especially in IT and a lot of things that can deliver supernormal returns that very few countries can even dream of. And that does not mean we've matched it with what we need to vertically to dominate those ideas. We've unfortunately outsourced a lot of manufacturing to China, but I don't think that's unrecoverable. Now, the question I would to talk about what you said, I do think that there's a lot of capital flows that I mean, I didn't listen to what you listened to, but I'm thinking the podcasts you were listening to are not necessarily just talking about the genesis of future wealth, but like things like more about like our dominance.
Yeah, it's more to do with financial markets and, like you're saying, capital flows. And I think I think you're spot on that, like the US exceptionalism, right? There are certain things that we have that are durable, but I think they were more focused on, okay, which way are the markets going to move, and what is S&P going to do versus some of the European stocks versus whatever, right? So that's, I think, what their focus was on when it comes to the U.S. exceptionalism.
I think, like, I don't follow Barton Armstrong very closely. Tom is a better person to talk to, but I definitely think his, I wouldn't even say it's backward looking analysis, but he's crunching a lot of data. And, I think that I was actually just talking to Tom about this morning is I don't find that like worrying about how rational actors behave rationally is that's not like the big. I don't want to deploy time, capital, and compute power to figure out what rational actors are going to do when they're acting in their own best economic interest. What concerns me is something like China, who will always be a rational actor, but may be pushed to start acting in ways that are economically irrational for the objective of harming us, which is strategically rational for them. And that, I don't mean selling treasuries, although people could argue, oh, they don't have enough treasuries to hurt us more than they hurt themselves if they were to dump them all. You know, we would just monetize the debt and be like, oh, great, we'll just refi that and buy it back for nothing and then just erase it. Here you go. You want useless dollars? Have fun. They're yours. You know, it's like, we want to make the dollar weaker anyway. That's our new policy. Great, thanks. You know,
Yeah.
Oh, $1 trillion in bonds, so you have it 200 billion. Fuck you.
Yeah.
Oh, you put all in the market at the same time. There's no debate. You know what I mean? Like, there's, you know, walk me through why I should worry about such a scenario. I'm talking more about how they can do more subtle things. Like, I think what these podcasts were talking about, like everybody's worried about basis trade. Everybody's worried about this and that. I'm like, all right, well, we survived COVID. We survived 9/11. We're willing to do crazy things at the event horizon. I think Powell's got the chops. I think Besant's got the chops to handle moments like that. And unfortunately, the only answer I have for you is we have to wait for those super normal events and see what happens. Because I don't know how you prepare for. I mean, I hope some part of the idea that the whole world's turning against America is, you know, bloviating journalistic exaggeration.
Yeah. I do. Before we finish off, I do want to get your thoughts on commodities. And I know that it's makes sense to start with gold. And I mean, we're already an hour in, haven't really talked about it at all. But I think it is interesting to see the run that gold has had. And some people are calling for a top. Other people are pointing out what's happening when Chinese markets open versus when US markets or European markets open. But I think a pretty durable bull market in gold is underway. Whether it pulls back here, I mean, it's definitely possible. But I think that'd be a good place to start on commodities, and then we can kind of take it into any other areas you find interesting as far as the commodity space.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up a gold silver ratio chart real quick.
It's over 100, right?
Yeah, it's 102. And
generally a pretty good time to buy silver.
Yep. Well, see, that's a great, maybe that's, I mean, with the time we have left, I was talking to a good friend the other day about how much you can respect the, let me get a multi-year open here. Okay. So when I look at, well, 2020, that's not even enough. So looking at the gold to silver ratio, obviously you can look at times and be like, oh, look at that. But it's telling you two different things. One, like, did silver take a dump for some reason, or did gold go up? You know, did gold go down for some reason? And, you know, look on the chart for, you know, oh God, what was the name of the guy who cornered the silver market?
Hunt Brothers.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't even have that time period open, but I know that if I found it, there'd be a big spike, right? And then a big drop. Mm-hmm. Well, the drop doesn't mean anything about gold, right? And so now when I look at where we are now, is like, does the chart tell me anything really about silver? Or is gold demand now just structurally changing? Like, are people gaming the possibility of the return of gold-backed currencies? And if they're doing that, are they not gaming the return specifically of silver to that role? Because I was kind of going through with this person saying, look, I actually think silver demand might, the gold silver ratio on a forward basis might not be quite the same information stream as it was in the past, because I think crypto and stable coins play a very interesting role for the speculation about based currencies going forward. And as we contemplate, right or wrong, and again, I understand that people are going to roll their eyes, and I roll my eyes even as I say it, as we contemplate like the end of central bank controlled currencies, fiat wise, being replaced with something based, I think gold's always going to have a role, but I can imagine a world where silver doesn't. And I can imagine a world where it's gold plus a stable coin a lot more than I necessarily believe it's gold plus silver. And I know that's a weird take, but that's kind of what I've been chewing on lately. I'm trying to understand is, one, I don't put a lot of probability, a lot of high probability on, the world suddenly adapting rational monetary and fiscal policy at the same time. That's not what I expect to happen when I wake up. But, I do think speculating on precious metals has a lot of that kind of thinking in it. Like, there is the idea, I think a lot of gold's recent rise obviously is driven by uncertainty and inflation preparation and all the classic reasons why gold can go up. And one of those reasons is like, oh, we've pushed this to a point where we have to fix some number of the world's currencies. I'm not sure if that's a nuts take or not, but that's what I do think that it's going to be an interesting question going forward. And I probably would tell you, had you talked to me, hell, even if you ask me right now, I probably only think Bitcoin is a commodity. I don't really think ETH and the rest of it I would call a commodity in the same way. And I'm not sure, I guess you can't really call a stable coin a commodity, can you?
Yeah.
It's got a fixed price.
Yeah, I think to your point, if you are seeing all these things, like I'm not the only one to kind of see this writing on the wall of, okay, everyone, including central banks and countries, are positioning for gold having a bigger role in the financial system broadly moving forward, right? Maybe we do just kind of get gold marching higher and silver doesn't really react. But I think my general view on what's going to happen is, right, gold, I think, has to go a lot higher. But I think when you look at like gold to silver, gold to oil, hell, even gold to platinum, I think there's going to be almost like a gravity type drag on, like, okay, gold's ripping, say we get to 5,000 an ounce in 2 years. Hell, it could be sooner, but just say by end of 2027, right? Do people really expect that silver's still going to be like below $40 or oil's going to be below $70 a barrel or platinum is like 1,000 an ounce? I don't know. I mean, that's where I kind of see. I think gold has to go higher, but I think there has to be some sort of connection to other commodities, other stuff that can't be printed,
Yeah, I mean, my whole thing before was basically talking myself out of, becoming a silver bull. Like, if you look just at the gold silver ratio, it was 111 in 2020, which is right at COVID. So, we can guess why that. I don't think it was because silver crashed. But that's the highest it's been since 95. And the rest of it kind of, I'm just doing a visual linear regression. 66, I would say 66, 70. If you take out the COVID part, like it's, we're way above a 30-year look back. So why shouldn't I just buy silver and think, oh, this is the smartest play ever, because then the ratio is going to close and then I'll just buy gold because I'm just buying discounted gold. Well, that's always been the take on, the silver thing, but I'm pulling up a platinum chart here really quick. I'm just curious. When you mentioned it, I said to myself, I feel platinum's fairly flat.
Yeah, it's been bouncing around like 1,000 an ounce. I don't check it all that often, but
yeah, forever, Now, I mean, it had its moments where it spiked, but that's been a while. Like since 14. I mean, it's like,
I think it's overdue by like the end of this decade. I think it's going to be, from what I've seen on industrial demand and hybrids, EVs, all this other stuff, everyone's pricing that, okay, we don't need platinum or any PGMs moving forward. And it's, I think the like above ground supply has been continuously draining down. And it's actually, I think, was it 30 times more scarce than gold? So it's pretty interesting setup as far as, okay, you're below the cost to mine it. It's only really mined in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Russia. And you kind of do the math and figure out where things have to go, especially if we don't just all start driving electric vehicles.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that, though, there's a lot of reasons why gold demand can rise in excess of, I'll put it this way. If we're at 100, like, I can see gold at 5,000 without having to, like, I can see silver at 50 and gold at 5,000 is the same ratio as today. I can see the ratio holding all the way up to 5,000 is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So I feel like the linear responsiveness of peaks in the gold silver ratio might not be telling us the same things they used to, because I think gold demand is just could be on its own set of rules going forward. And then throw in what, now the Chinese population is aging. People on pensions don't tend to necessarily invest for the future the way they do when they're in their 40s. And the younger generation, China, is basically dealing with massive unemployment. And they're probably not going to buy gold when the government tells them to, because they don't have any money. But like, China demand could be huge. India demand is huge. And like, I can think of a lot of currencies, and I'm not saying the rupee or the yuan, but like, I can think of a lot of currencies in the world that have a much more dicey future than the US dollar. And I think a lot of people in those countries understand gold pretty at a basic level. So I feel like gold's demand has not even been tapped. And then the other thing is, there's way more junk silver, even though, yes, it's hard to find silver out there in retail. The average person, over a certain age has a tea set somewhere in their house with like 80 ounces of silver in it. At some point they're going to realize that, and it's just because it's cheap. Like, there's just a lot of silver just sits in the closet. If silver were to really spike, all of a sudden you'd see a ton of melt coming in, old coin collections and shit like that. Cause if you hang out with too many libertarians, you think everyone knows where all the silver is, but they don't. There's so many normal people who have a ton of silver. It's not just like, I have these Liberty Times. It's like, okay, it's not what we're talking about, man.
Yeah. No, it is. I do think you're right. There is definitely been a structural change in what's going on with gold that doesn't have to flow through to other commodities. My point was just that eventually there's going to be, I think that there's going to be some sort of connection from gold to like other stuff that can't be printed. And that, I think, relative to like fiat currencies priced in US dollars, priced in whatever currency you want, I think there's a pretty interesting setup for what we have from here until the end of the decade. Just because I think I was looking at it and I've heard people talking about this, but gold typically tends to lead like broad moves in the commodities complex by like 12 to 18 months. So I think we'll see if that pattern holds true or not. But I do want to ask if you have any thoughts on energy, oil, natural gas, any of those places. That's been an area of focus lately. I've got a couple of my favorite ideas in that sector, but the question I want to ask is, like, right, you had the conveniently timed OPEC announcement along with the tariff announcement. It was what, $15 a barrel down in like 2 or 3 days, but it's bounced back held up pretty well in the last week. But where do you kind of see things going for energy markets from here?
All of my answers, I think, are going to come behind the lens of what is Lee Zeldin doing, and what are we going to see in terms of new license lease and other stuff. There's obviously regulatory zones inside the United States. Like, California is a good example, where you can't necessarily do what the federal government tells you can do without getting through the state. So yeah, there's sort of caveats, but I think we're at the midst of across the board, coal, gas, nuclear, and specifically talking about like small nuclear reactor permitting, and oil. I think we're going to see massive U.S. development, and then there's also, frankly, a lot of weird Canadian interplay. I'm not sure I want to even get into that in the answer, but like there's the whole like what's going to happen with U.S. Canada policy. I guess let's talk about that if we see if like what happens in the actual election. I might have two different answers for the Carney versus Polyev futures, although I don't think they're materially that different. But for the U.S., like we're going to have a lot of new potential supply opportunities that are going to take a while to get online. But I think this administration is absolutely prioritizing energy through deregulation and, like increased leases and opening up lands or offshore tracks that were closed. And I think that's going to be weirdly, although everyone thinks Trump is so pro-Russia, I think there's going to be definitely some impacts on global oil price but I think it's probably a year away. Although the U.S. has surprised me before at the speed at which we were able to, few industries. I mean, oil is like the champion of being able to very rapidly like surprise you in terms of the amount of supply they can bring on board once they're unhandcuffed.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. From what I've seen with what's been going on in recent weeks, the Permian production and other areas like total U.S. production is in a rough spot, at least at current prices. And I think it'd be good for the U.S. to open up more energy opportunities and deal with the leases. I just have questions about how economic some of that stuff is going to be, like how economic it'll be at 65 or 70 or 75, right? There's been talk about Alaska and sovereign wealth fund and all these things. And I think it's like that's my bias, obviously, but I think it'll be interesting to see what the appetite is for drill baby drill, which I think is more of a political slogan depending on where oil prices are at.
I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of electric, filtered coal electric coming on board, to the horror of a lot of environmentalists. The U.S. grid needs a lot of work. I don't personally think it needs the work for AI reasons, but I think we need it for just energy inputs in general are a huge driver of inflation. If you make energy cheaper and you want to reindustrialize the United States, there's no way you can't surround it. You can't surround that mission around like an energy policy based on a plurality of sources. I think small nuclear is huge on the list. I think maybe in the future we can talk about uranium. I think we're going to be doing a little deep dive on uranium in the newsletter, Tom and I, in the near future, because it's just becoming a very compelling part. I do think coal has been much maligned. I don't think we should follow Germany and we have nat gas obviously in abundance. There's so many ways we can build a lot of power plants quickly that I think we're going to do it too. And there's a ton of reasons to do it. And I think this administration views investing in energy, and I would even throw like pipeline infrastructure. They view it more like building an interstate than necessarily trying to say, oh, it's instantaneously profitable at X dollars a barrel, And especially, look, if we build more pipelines to pull oil out of Canada to refining in America, we keep Canada neutralized for a while. Like, apparently we were starting to view them in an antagonistic manner. Well, the smartest thing to do then is to use their environmental policies, which are more green than ours, against them. Let them ship us all their oil. Let them have no refineries. Let them play that virtue signaling card, and we'll just, take all their output and refine it, sell some back to them, but export the rest ourselves. Because apparently they don't want to make those investments. They're too pure and righteous. Great, fine.
I think Alberta
build Keystone XL2, 3, 4, 12, whatever.
I think Alberta will have something to say about that at some point. But
yeah, I mean, look, I'll welcome them in. Whatever they want to, fine. We'll kick out Puerto Rico. I'm against the 51st state though. Like, we don't need any more God, all of Canada, we'd lose the House forever. Has no one thought about this?
Yeah,
But
I
I'm
think
all for
it's
I'm all for former Canadian U.S. territories. It sounds fine to me.
yeah, I think it's Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then
Yeah,
wait and see. So,
yeah, and then
um,
whatever the polar bear, the Nunavut, like again, I mean, if Trump wants Arctic Circle, like there you go.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a
Maybe
lot of moving pieces.
we should just arm the Quebecers and sit back and watch.
Yeah, that's I do think in my lifetime, this is like longer term, could happen sooner, but in my lifetime, I think we will see at least parts of Canada become part of the US, whether that's as a state or territory or whatever it is. It's up for debate, but I think that's kind of where things are headed, regardless of what the short term noise is. But anyway,
Yeah.
um, before I finally let you go, I do have to ask for another book recommendation, my
Oh
traditional
God.
closing question, because last time you gave me The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt, if I'm
Yep.
saying that right.
Yep.
So if you have another book recommendation, I'd love to hear it.
All right. Let me turn around here and look. What'd you think of The Goal, by the way? Did you read it?
I haven't had any spare time basically with my schedule to read any of these. So I'm basically building a list and we'll be checking it twice, but buying all these at some point in the future and basically spending a good chunk to get like the library up and running. So
I don't know that this. Hold on, I'm just grabbing the book that I was reading. It's kind of probably influencing my thought a lot lately, but it's called Unrestricted Warfare, and it's a PLA series of essays from before 9/11, and I think most importantly before the bombing of China's embassy in Belgrade. Yes. Okay.
I think I've read bits and pieces of that one.
It's a
So I know what
really
you're talking about.
interesting. I think it's like the best view of Chinese asymmetrical thinking that needs to be balanced with a post Belgrade and post 9/11 reaction to the hyper, the George W. Bush campaign in Iraq. I'll put it this way: this book is a reaction to the Schwarzkopf H.W. Bush Iraq, show of force. And I've kind of been reading in three areas lately. One is kind of a post end of history, kind of reevaluating the end of history time period. And it's that late 90s is a very interesting thing because especially for those of us who kind of live through the infinite now of the post 9/11 universe, in our adult years, I forgot how much, just like what it was like in the late 90s, just the type of worldview that was common in terms of internationally. And 9/11 just changed so much, and it was such a enduring kind of not just a trauma, but the reaction to it changed the very way that you remembered things. I mean, in many ways, COVID was like that. Like a lot of us are looking back right now at something that happened 5 years ago, and you're like, wait a minute, how has 5 years gone by? And then you realize, well, 3 years of your life, you kind of weren't time binding, right? Like COVID, like everybody lost 1, maybe 2 years, right? Your
Yep.
memories don't stack the same way. And 9/11 did the same thing for like 5 years. I think most people don't really remember, in this age band, older people at this point, but they don't really remember the first Bush term the way they remember the second Clinton term, like just in granularity. Like you just every day you wake up and it's a daily bunch of crazy stuff happening. And it's interesting to read a book like Unrestricted Warfare that gives you this sort of distilled, like 1998 perspective by then a still a very poor China who's trying to figure out a way to compete in the world. It's kind of fascinating, and because a lot of their through line of the way they see the battlefield is kind of in this book. Now, granted, the zeal and a lot of Xi's coloring of the Chinese establishment in terms of his princeling origins and his specific ways, certainly there's a whole different CCP out there. But I think strategically, it's a very interesting book to read, and a lot of it, tilts your, gets you thinking about things like global shipping and asymmetric disguised platforms.
Yeah.
It's called Unrestricted Warfare. It is available on Amazon. The authors are Colonel Chao Liang and Colonel Wang Shangshui. I'll send you the link. You can put it in the show notes.
No, definitely have to check that out. I think you're spot on that the like COVID circus was definitely a time warp for I think a lot of people, and it's I'm not sure if we are starting to get back to normal or if we're just in like a decade where there's going to be some series of events where you just bounce from one thing to the next. But it's definitely we definitely live in interesting times.
To bookend what we started with, the media has always understood viscerally since the 1920s onward that the more anxious you make a person, the more susceptible they are to suggestion. And this is it's totally in play when you have an actual trauma, when you have an actual emergency, COVID, 9/11, but they're always trying to create it. So, this is their stock and trade. So, distrust, verify.
Yep. The listeners should be familiar with Gold, Goats, and Guns, but if they want to find you on social media or find any of your work, where can they look for you?
Dexter K. White on X, and then everything else, the Gold, Goats, and Guns, pretty much go to tomluongo.me, and links to our Patreon are there. And then you can find our podcast on our website, which is, going to all come. You can go to goldgoatsandguns.com, same website, same forward. So tomluongo.me is usually easier for people to type.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you taking the time. It was a fascinating conversation. I think it'll give people a lot to think about on a lot of different topics. But I think with that, we'll be wrapping up. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.